Hello. So this video was created by Jacqueline, Carolina, and Alexandra, and our group decided to focus on the Chicano Houston boycotts. But before we begin, we would like to just give a brief overview of what we'll be going over, as well as a small introductions of the boycotts themselves. The Chicano Houston boycotts were a series of protests and legal actions against the Houston Independent School District in the 1970s. These boycotts manifested throughout a 3-week period where Chicano students challenged administration. This was because the Houston Independent School District refused to recognize Chicano students as a minority when desegregating schools. Chicano students looked for help, and by looking for that help, they stumbled across the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, who helped them file a lawsuit against the school district alleging segregation. Later on, the Mexican American Education Council coordinated protests, boycotts, and picketing. Around 3,500 Chicano students boycotted the school district, all the way from elementary to high school students. Around 60% of students in the school district participated in these boycotts. In response, these students attended huelga schools instead. The huelga schools were schools made by and for Chicano students. The Houston Independent School District rezoned school areas to address the concerns raised by the boycotts. However, this rezoning led to white flight as minorities entered white schools. The district initially used forced busing, but later switched to a magnet school program. Overall, the Chicano movement, also known as El Movimiento, was a social and political movement that fought for equality at work and school and to regain Chicano culture. So that was just a brief introduction of the boycotts themselves. The other group members will be going more in depth about the 3 weeks at hand during the boycotts, as well as the aftermath and what resulted from the boycotts themselves. And now we're going to be going into kind of the historical part of the video, kind of explaining what was going on during the time, any significant historical events that led up to the boycotts as well, and any information about any local history from our own areas as well. One of the most prominent acts during the time was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or nationality.
Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
This was a permanent act because it outlawed segregation. And even though it outlawed segregation, it still gave schools the ability to segregation within their district without directly saying they were segregating their schools. This was exemplified by the allocation of resources provided in the white schools versus the non-white schools, as well as the education being taught at both. Next, we're going to be talking about the disguise of Mexicans in white schools. In response to the segregation in schools, parents decided to take matters into their own hands and integrate their children into the white schools. This was often done by white-passing children. They presented more Eurocentric features and had lighter skin tones. They were also changing their full names to attend the schools as well. The Vietnam War was a war that divided the country and even the world. The draft was a huge event happening from 1964 to 1973. Thousands of students across the nation refused to participate in this war. This led to protests in various schools and universities, like UC Berkeley. Students refused to participate in many ways. One of them was protesting, while others burned their draft cards. We can focus a bit more local to see how students were handling the draft in our own local communities. In 1965, a group of students at UCI were protesting the draft. Their protest had started at the UCI campus, and they walked all the way to the El Toro Marine Corps base. This base has been shut down for a couple of years now. From those protests, the Marines were able to capture a few license plates and names of students who organized the protests. They began spying on them for numerous years. In a 1999 report done by a reporter in a news article by the LA Times, they tracked down the leader of the protest, who was Patty Parmalee. Parmalee didn't know that the FBI and military were onto her for all those years. A case like such were just some of the ways students were being treated during the time of the draft. It's also really important to acknowledge that during this time and leading up to the Chicano boycotts, desegregation had already been happening within Houston, but this was primarily affecting white communities and white students and Black communities and Black students, and it never really applied to Latino students, more specifically Chicano students in Texas.
Houston boycotts 1970. Community leaders reported significant achievement in mobilizations with thousands of participants in demonstrations and boycotts. Negotiations were planned with the school authorities to demand official recognitions as a minority group. They believed the system was using Chicanos to fulfill integration goals without addressing their education needs. Mexican American community leaders organized a boycott protesting educational segregation policies that paired Mexican students with African American students, disregarding the unique ethnic identity of Mexican Americans. The strike includes both non-attendance at the school and alternative educations in strike schools. Official recognition of Mexican American as a distinct ethnic minority group includes a Mexican in school administrative positions, guarantees against reprisals for students and parents participating in the boycotts. Tensions arose with the Mexican American community regarding tactics and strategies. Conservative Mexican American groups opposed the boycott, arguing that the issue should be resolved legally rather than politically. Malded filed a lawsuit claiming the segregation plans violated the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1974 by failing to recognize Mexican American as a distinct minority group. Although progress was made in negotiations, the boycott continued as a show of unity and maintained pressure for system changes in Houston educational systems. The school board agreed to 70 of our MAEC's 20 original demands, including the most critical ones: recognitions Mexican American as an ethnic minority group. Appealing the debating decision of the Supreme Court, creation of specific programs to address the educational needs of Mexican American, including bilingual educational and scholarships, proportional representation in school committees and activities. The positive impact, the agreement and conciliation measures strengthened the Mexican American community trust in the school institutions.
The legacy of the Houston boycotts continue to impact the education of Chicanos throughout the United States to this day. Some of the organizations that arose during the boycotts may have only lasted for a short while, but the impact bore the fruit for integration within education. For example, Huelga schools, otherwise known as freedom schools, became widely popular during this time period. Huelga schools were an effort to continue educating Mexican children while simultaneously boycotting the Houston Independent School District. These schools focused on reading and writing, but also on educating Mexican children of their ancestry. This is a thread that we continue to see today in ethnic studies courses across the country, especially Chicanx Latinx studies. Mayo and the Black and Brown Coalition are some examples of two groups that emerged during the Houston boycotts that signified a rising sense of unity within Latino and Black communities. The Mexican American Youth Organization, or Mayo for short, was a group of young Chicano students who hoped to advocate for cultural nationalism and political change via mass protest. Although later dissolving, Mayo helped to increase voter registration within the Southwest Texas region, and they helped to support the Houston boycotts. In a similar status, the Black and Brown Coalition, or BBC, was a community-based group in Houston that advocated for the implementation of tri-ethnic education in all schools. While the BBC only lasted for about a year, it drew support from parents of all races, proving to be an early form of interracial activist groups. The busing programs were perhaps one of the biggest successes that were a result of many boycotts, including the Houston ones, that occurred throughout the country. In the case of Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in 1971 that busing programs must be integrated in schools in order to aid in the desegregation of inner and outer city schools. The busing programs are very similar to the bus systems that we have in place today, which ensure that students of color have access to reliable transportation in order to get to and from school regardless of distance. Finally, the East LA blowouts are perhaps some of the most widely known school protests that occurred within the 20th century. The overwhelming amount of support from fellow Latinos across the United States and an increase in protests, such as the Houston boycotts, demonstrated to educational institutions that Latinos were no longer going to be quiet and take the underwhelming resources that were handed to them. Instead, these protests fostered community and proved to the white habitus that when unionized, Latinos could make change.